leader. They asked how many horses Leshai had. Well, she knew it was a lot. There seemed to be a pasture full of them. But what we get from her is the picture of Leshai, the private man. The only picture we have of him is anything other than an abstraction with a gun in his hand. So we learn a little bit about his life here. And in one spot, she touched on a mystery that's tantalized treasure hunters for a long time. One time, when we were way up in the mountains and out of water, Leshai went down into a deep place where he could hear water running ever so far down. While Leshai was down there, he found gold and brought some of it up with him and showed it to me. But I didn't think much about it then. And I know I could not find the place again. And that is the reason I have always refused to try. Though some Bostons have offered me money if I would tell them the place was, or where the place was. Now, all sorts of things tumble out of those archive boxes. I'll start this around. Sometimes it's things you just as soon not find. Now, when I was doing the research at the State Historical Society back there in the 70s and 80s, it was in the old building down by Stadium High School. I used to, every day when I would come in through the first floor, I'd pass this great covered wagon that Ezra Meeker had used in the early part of the 20th century to retrace the Oregon Trail, which he had followed in his youth coming out here. And it was Ezra Meeker retracing that trail, giving talks in town after town, selling postcards, raising money, seeing to the erection of monuments. This Meeker, probably more than any other single human being who saved the Oregon Trail for posterity. And there, with that wagon at the museum, were the two companions of the great adventure of his life, these two stuffed oxen, Dandy and Dave. And I used to think, what a moving tribute to the two great companions of the great adventure of his life. Yeah, I didn't stop to wonder how he paid for that taxidermy. So by that time, he had lost his fortune. And then one day in an archive box, out came a small clipping from probably the Tacoma News Tribune. It was undated. But the newspaper clipping reminded me that Ezra Meeker was a farmer with a farmer's unromantic notions of the utility of animals. The clipping said that the oxen were going to be butchered and fed to the lions at Point Defiance Zoo to pay for their taxidermy. Oh, well, yeah, talk about illusion shattered. I did find out later that while one of those oxen was a very agreeable sort, a pretty passive animal, the other one spent most of the journey tracing the Oregon Trail trying to kick and bite Ezra Meeker. I figured maybe he knew what was coming. Now, after you've exhausted the primary sources, generally you turn to other things. The first things you turn to are newspapers. Unfortunately, we had two good newspapers on Puget Sound in 1855 and 56. And another nice thing about them is that they were radically different in their editorial style. Those days, newspapers were generally organs of a political party. And the Olympia paper was a pioneer Democrat, and it was a supporter of Governor Stevens, who was a Democrat. And the Steilacoom paper was a Whig paper, which was a party gradually turning into the Republicans. And in that one, the Steilacoom paper, they were almost conciliatory toward the Indians because they were calling this Governor Stevens' war. But in the Olympia paper, the Indians were, if I can remember rightly, cowards, fiends, and detestable brutes within the space of one issue. But it was front page news in both papers, so we learned a lot there about what was going on in the war, and sometimes you'd get a glimpse of what was going on behind the scenes, about the people who stayed behind and didn't fight. Now, a few years before the war, there was a fellow by the name of Lemuel Bills who advertised in the Steilacoom paper for a wife. It was a joking sort of letter that no one could possibly take seriously unless your name happened to be Ellen Brooks. And Ellen answered his letter, and they began corresponding through the newspaper. I don't know if they ever met, but Their correspondence makes some of the most syrupy, high Victorian nonsense that you ever heard in your life. And this is what she wrote in December 1855, right at the height of the war, to the man she called the dear corn dodger of my affections. Where are you, Lemuel, during these times that try the pluck of men and the souls of women? Now's the time to immortalize your name. So go in, Lemuel. I repeat it, Lemuel, go in. Oh, Lemuel, that you could become great. Oh, that one feather might be plucked from the tail of that venerable bird, the American eagle, for the purpose of inscribing upon the annals of fame the name of my Lemuel. So pitch in, my rooster, and acquit yourself in such a manner that when the last roar of Uncle Sam's flintlock muskets have died away, when the present age shall have grown into antiquity, your name will stand first on the pages of the illustrious men of Washington. And in a few years, may those who point to the obelisk reared to perpetuate your memory be enabled to say, there lies the patriot Lemuel Bills, and beside him, his wife Ellen. Now, then you start to wonder, where is the rest of the story after you've worked those primary sources? And you find out, well, what happens to documents that don't survive? Fire accounts for so many of them, accidents to others. There was a diary that was kept by Lieutenant August Valentine Coutts. He was an officer in the regular army. He was in the thick of the fighting. He was wounded in one of the last battles of the war. And he kept a diary for a number of years. A volume that survived was kept at later years at Fort Steilacoom. And it's been very helpful to the folks that are trying to interpret the history of that spot. But the diary for the war years, for this period from about, I believe he arrived about January 1856, and he was fighting up through April. He was crossing a stream about a year after the war, and was holding his diary, and it slipped from his hands, washed downstream, was lost forever. Indifference accounts for a lot of other things. It always does. It's just that things are left behind and are not recognized as important. I was reading a little while ago about Robert Gray, the discoverer of Gray's Harbor and the Columbia River, that years after he had died, when the government needed his logbooks from the ship Columbia to help prove their claim to the part of the world we're living on right now, they went to his descendants, his surviving family members, and asked for the logbooks. Well, one of them survived, but the other one was just in fragments. It turned out that they'd been using pages every day to start the fire and the stove and to wipe up spills. And sometimes it's protective wives that account for things. I found out that Martha Washington burned nearly every letter that George wrote to her. Sir Richard Burton, the great explorer of Africa, same thing. It was a dutiful wife who burned everything when he died. I was reading about Junius Brutus Booth. That was the father of John Wilkes Booth, and he was a great Shakespearean actor, one of the greatest of his age in his own right. And when he died, his wife began to burn his letters, as apparently it was a wife's duty to do in those days. And the children begged her. They said that these were letters written by some of the great men of the day. Well, she relented to a certain extent. She burned the letters, but she cut off the signatures. Handed them this handful of signatures, one of which was Edgar Allan Poe. You really wonder what went up in flames. Now, once you've done what's called the above-ground archaeology, once you've gone through every book and manuscript you can find, there's no substitute then for trying to go out into the field, try to find the same places this had happened. You try to be there maybe the same time of day, the same time of year. You see the same blue twilights, the same gray fog, the same rain-swollen rivers and dripping forests. And always you ask yourself, what must it have been like? And sometimes you meet people out there that help you along the way. At a point when you start to wonder why you ever started this thing, and you doubt that you're ever going to finish it, you meet someone like Walter Shoddy and his wife, who were very helpful to a stranger who came to Connell's Prairie one day to try to find out what had happened there. Now, Walter Shoddy was a big fellow, huge hands. He'd done a lifetime of hard work. He was a dairyman. He lived on Connell's Prairie, and that's where the first gunshots of the war took place. That's where the last battle was fought months later. And he let me look through a property deed that went all the way back to Michael Connell, who was an Irish immigrant who'd settled there, gave his name to the prairie, who died in the first volley of gunfire there. And I read page after page about his Irish relatives trying to get title to this land, which they never were able to do. It finally reverted back into American hands, and eventually Walter Shoddy and his family lived there, as had his father. He took down out of a cupboard a jar of arrowheads and spear points that he'd plowed from the land. It was proof enough that Indians had crossed this prairie countless times in the last 6,000 years. And then one day he told me the story of this headless skeleton. It seemed that long about 1954, they decided they wanted some fencing put up along their dairy land, and sent a workman out to dig fence post holes. And as he was digging, he noticed at one spot, as he got near the top of a hill, that there were some bones in this hole. And he started widening the hole, and as he got looking at it, well, these bones were pretty clearly human. And one person told another, and as neighborhood rumor will have it, eventually a police car came screaming up the driveway demanding to be shown this murder victim that had been found. Well, if it was a murder victim, it was a very old one. The bones were quite clearly Indian. You could tell by the flattened skull. It was a practice that many of the coastal Salish Indians practiced. And nobody quite knew what to do with him. No one was sure if he was one of the Indians who died that day in the Battle of Connell's Prairie in March 1856, or if he was just a seasonal hop picker who died there maybe in the 1890s and was quietly buried. And the skull, in the unenlightened days of the 1950s, was taken away and put in a museum. And the skeleton was left there in the ground. So it's there to this day, the headless skeleton of Connell's Prairie with a fence post for a headstone. And just every now and then something will drop out of the sky. When you think you've found everything that you're going to find, well, something will happen. I wrote a short article for the News Tribune about the murder of Leshai's brother Plymouth in the governor's mansion in Olympia. And afterwards, a letter poured in. Writing is a very glamorous thing. Someday you get maybe one or two letters every now and then. And this letter was from a gentleman by the name of David Hibbard. And he told me a lot of things. He had lived around there a very long time, as had his family and his wife's family. Very interesting. And one of the things he had to say was about Fort Eaton, which is a fort that was built in Thurston County to house a lot of the settlers who try to collect for mutual protection. The backcountry was pretty well emptied out during the war. Like Steilacoom got a little bigger because the few folks that lived in Tacoma went there. But the folks in that area went to Fort Eaton. And he wrote, the time came shortly to hoist a red flag to notify stragglers of Indian danger. No red flag was handy, so they took off the little red underskirt of 3-year-old Elizabeth McAllister. A young soldier boy named Isaac Hawk climbed up a pole and tied the red flag. A dozen years later, he married this little girl, my wife's grandmother. So, at the end, you start to realize that history isn't just something that happened back east somewhere, and it isn't just politicians and generals and better machines. It's about ordinary people in extraordinary times. It's about people like Mulahey and Mary Leshai, who witnessed history in spite of themselves. Sometimes it's about little girls with red underskirts. You don't find them easily. You can't go to the